Book 2, Chapter 10, The Gens at Rome and in Greece. We find in the writings of Roman jurists and in Greek writers the traces of an antique institution which appears to have had its flourishing period in the first ages of Greek and Italian societies, but which, becoming enfeebled by degrees, left vestiges that were hardly perceptible in the later portion of their history. We speak of what the Romans called gens and the Greeks genos. As the nature and constitution of the gens have been much discussed, it may not be amiss here to point out what has constituted the difficulty of the problem. The gens, as we shall see presently, formed a body whose constitution was radically aristocratic. It was through their internal organization that the patriarchs of Rome and the eupatrids of Athens were able to perpetuate their privileges for so long a time. No sooner had the popular party gained the upper hand than they attacked this old institution with all their power. If they had been able completely to destroy it, they would probably not have left us the slightest memorial of it. But it was singularly endowed with vitality and deeply rooted in their manners, and they could not entirely blot it out. They therefore contented themselves with modifying it. They took away its essential character and left only its external features, which were not in the way of the new regime. Thus, at Rome, the plebeians undertook to form gentes, in imitation of the patricians. At Athens, they attempted to overthrow the gentes, to blend them together, and to replace them by the demes, which were established in imitation of them. We shall have to return to the subject when we speak of the revolutions. Let it suffice here for us to remark that this profound alteration which the democracy introduced into the regime of the gens is of a nature to mislead those who undertake to learn its primitive constitution. Indeed, almost all of the information concerning it that has come down to us dates from the epoch when it had been thus transformed, and shows us only that part which the revolutions had allowed to subsist. Let us suppose that 20 centuries hence all knowledge of the Middle Ages has perished, that there remain no documents relating to what passed before the Revolution of 1789, and that, notwithstanding this, an historian of that time wishes to form an idea of institutions of an earlier date. The only documents that he would have at hand would show him the nobility of the 19th century, that is to say, something very different from that of feudalism. But he would suspect that a great revolution had taken place, and he would rightly conclude that this institution, like all the others, must have been modified. This nobility, which his authorities would describe to him, would no longer be for him anything but the shadow or the enfeebled and altered image of another nobility, incomparably more powerful. Finally, if he examined with attention the slight remains of ancient monuments, a few expressions preserved in the language, a few terms escaped from the law, vague souvenirs or sterile regrets, he would perhaps be able to conjecture something concerning the feudal system, and would obtain an idea of the institutions of the Middle Ages that would not be very far from the truth. The difficulty would assuredly be great, nor is it less for him who today desires to understand the antique gens, for he has no information regarding it except what dates from a time when it was no longer anything but a shadow of itself. We will commence by analyzing all that the ancient writers tell us of the gens, that is to say, what remained of it at the epoch when it was already greatly changed. Then, by the aid of these remains, we shall attempt to catch a glimpse of the veritable system of the antique gens. 1. What ancient writers tell us of the gens. If we open a Roman history at the time of the Punic Wars, we meet 3 personages whose names are Claudius Pulcher, Claudius Nero, and Claudius Cantho, All three belong to the same gens, the Claudian gens. Demosthenes, in one of his orations, produces 7 witnesses who certify that they belong to the same genos, that of the Britidae. What is remarkable in this example is that the 7 persons cited as members of the same genos are inscribed in 6 different demes. This shows that the genos did not correspond exactly with the deme, and was not, like it, a simple administrative division. Here is one fact established. There were gentes at Rome and at Athens. We might cite examples relative to many other cities of Greece and Italy, and conclude from them that, in all probability, this institution was universal among these ancient nations. Every gens had a special worship. In Greece, the members of the same gens were recognized by the fact that they had performed sacrifices in common from a very early period. Plutarch speaks of the place where the Lycomedae, and Agnates speaks of the altar of the gens of the Butidae. At Rome, too, each gens had religious ceremonies to perform. The day, the place, and the rites were fixed by its particular religion. When the capital is besieged by the Gauls, one of the Fabii, clothed in religious robes and carrying sacred objects in his hands, is seen to go out and cross the enemy's lines. He goes to offer sacrifice on the altar of his gens, which is situated on the Quirinal. In the Second Punic War, another Fabius, whom they called the Shield of Rome, is making head against Hannibal. Certainly it is of the first importance to the Republic that he remains with his army, and yet he leaves it in the hands of the imprudent Minucius. This is because the anniversary of the sacrifice of his gens has arrived, and he must be at Rome to perform the sacred act. It was a duty to perpetuate this worship from generation to generation, and every man was required to leave sons after him to continue it. Claudius, a personal enemy of Cicero, abandoned his gens to enter a plebeian family, and Cicero says to him, "Why do you expose the religion of the Claudian gens to the risk of becoming extinct through your fault?" The gods of the gens, dii gentiles, protected no other gens, and did not desire to be invoked by another. No stranger could be admitted to the religious ceremonies. It was believed that if a stranger had a part of the victim, or even if he merely assisted at the sacrifice, the gods of the gens were offended, and all the members were guilty of grave impiety. Just as every gens had its worship and its religious festivals, so also it had its common tomb. We read in an oration of Demosthenes, "This man, having lost his children, buried them in the tomb of his fathers, in that tomb that is common to all those of his gens." The rest of the oration shows that no stranger could be buried in this tomb. In another discourse, the same orator speaks of the tomb where the gens of the Bucelidae buried its members, and where every year it performed its funeral sacrifices. This burial place is a large field surrounded with an enclosure, according to the ancient custom. The same was the case among the Romans. Velleius Paterculus speaks of the tomb of the Quintilian gens, and Suetonius informs us that the Claudian gens had one on the slope of the Capitoline Hill. The ancient law of Rome permits the members of a gens to inherit from each other. The 12 Tables declare that, in default of sons and of agnates, the gentilis is the natural heir. According to this code, therefore, the gentiles are nearer akin than the cognates, that is to say, nearer than those related through females. Nothing is more closely united than the members of a gens. United in the celebration of the same sacred ceremonies, they mutually aid each other in all the needs of life. The entire gens is responsible for the debt of one of its members. It redeems the prisoner and pays the fine of one condemned. If one of its members becomes a magistrate, it unites to pay the expenses incident to the magistracy. The accused was accompanied to the tribunal by all the members of his gens. This marks the close relation which the law established between a man and the body of which he formed a part. For a man to plead or bear witness against one of his own gens was an act contrary to religion. A certain Claudius, a man of some rank, was a personal enemy of Appius Claudius the Decemvir. Yet when the latter was placed on trial and was menaced with death, this Claudius appeared in his defense and implored the people in his favor, but not without giving them notice that he took this step, not on account of any affection which he bore the accused, but as a duty. If a member of a gens could not accuse another member before a tribunal of the city, this was because there was a tribunal in the gens itself. Each gens had its chief, who was at the same time its judge, its priest, and its military commander. Everyone knows that when the Sabine family of the Claudi established itself at Rome, the 3,000 persons who composed it obeyed a single chief. Later, when the Fabii took upon themselves the whole war against the Veientes, we see that this gens had its chief, who spoke in its name before the Senate, and who led it against the enemy. In Greece, too, the gens had its chief. The inscriptions confirm this, and they show us that this chief generally bore the title of archon. Finally, in Rome, as in Greece, the gens had its assemblies. It passed laws which its members were bound to obey, and which the city itself respected. Such are the usages and laws which we find still in force at an epoch when the gens was already enfeebled and almost destroyed. Such are the remains of this ancient institution. 2. An examination of certain opinions that have been put forth to explain the Roman gens. On this subject, which has long been the theme of learned controversy, several theories have been offered. Some say that the gens was nothing more than a similarity in name. Others, that the word gens designated a sort of factitious relationship. Still others hold that the gens was merely the expression of a relation between a family which acted as patrons and other families that were clients. But none of these explanations answer to the whole series of facts, laws, and usages which we have just enumerated. Another opinion, more plausible, is that the gens was a political association of several families who were originally strangers to each other, and that, in default of ties of blood, the city established among them an imaginary union and a sort of religious relationship. But a first objection presents itself. If the gens is only a factitious association, how are we to explain the fact that its members inherited from each other? Why is the gentilis preferred to the cognate? It has been seen above what the rules of succession were, and we have pointed out the close and necessary relation which religion had established between the right of inheritance and masculine kinship. Can we suppose the ancient law deviated so far from this principle as to accord the right of succession to the gentiles if they had been strangers to each other? The best established and most prominent characteristic of the gens is that, like the family, it had a worship. Now, if we inquire what god each adores, we find almost always that it is a deified ancestor, and that the altar where the sacrifice is offered is a tomb. At Athens, the Eumolpidae worshipped Eumolpus, the author of their race. The Phytalidae adored the hero Phytalus, the Butidae, Butes, the Bucelidae, Bucellus, the Lachiadae, Lachios, and the Eminandridae, Cecrops. At Rome, the Claudi are descended from a Clausus. The Caeculi honored as the chief of their race the hero Caeculus, the Calpurni a Calpus, the Julii a Jullus, the Cloeli a Cloellus. We may easily suppose it is true that many of these genealogies were an afterthought, but we must admit that this sort of imposture would have had no motive if it had not been a constant usage among the real Gentes to recognize and to worship a common ancestor. Falsehood always seeks to imitate the truth. Besides, the imposture was not so easy as it might seem to us. This worship was not a vain formality for parade. One of the most rigorous rules of the religion was that no one should honor as an ancestor any except those from whom he was really descended. To offer this worship to a stranger was a grave impiety. If, then, the members of a gens adored a common ancestor, it was because they really believed they were descended from him. To counterfeit a tomb, to establish anniversaries and an annual worship, would have been to carry falsehood into what they held most dear, and to trifle with religion. Such a fiction was possible in the time of Caesar, when the old family religion was cherished by nobody. But if we go back to the time when this creed was in its vigor, we cannot imagine that several families, taking part in the same imposture, could say to each other, "We will pretend to have a common ancestor, we will erect him a tomb, we will offer him funeral repasts, and our descendants shall adore him in all future time." Such a thought could not have presented itself to their minds, or it would have been scouted as an impiety. In the difficult problems often found in history, it is well to seek from the terms of language all the instruction which they can afford. An institution is sometimes explained by the word that designates it. Now the word gens means exactly the same as the word genus. So completely alike are they that we can take the one for the other, and say indifferently, gens fabia and genus fabium. Both correspond to the verb gignere and the substantive genitor, precisely as genos corresponds to genan and to gonens. All these words convey the same idea of filiation. The Greeks also designated the member of a genos by the word homogalactis, which signifies nourished by the same milk. Let these words be compared with those which we are accustomed to translate by family, the Latin familia, the Greek oikos. Neither of these last has the sense of generation or of kinship. The true signification of familia is property. It designates the field, the house, money, and slaves, and it is for this reason that the 12 tables say, in speaking of the heir, familiam nuncitur, let him take the succession. As to oikos, it is clear that this word presents to the mind no other idea than that of property or of domicile. And yet these are the words that we habitually translate by family. Now, is it admissible that terms whose intrinsic meaning is that of domicile or property were often used to designate a family, and that other words whose primary sense is filiation, birth, paternity, have never designated anything but an artificial association? Certainly this would not be in conformity with the logic, so direct and clear, of the ancient languages. It is unquestionable that the Greeks and the Romans attached to the words gens and genos the idea of a common origin. This idea might have become obscured after the gens was modified, but the word has remained to bear witness of it. The theory that presents the gens as a factitious association has against it, therefore, first, the old legislation, which gives the gentiles the right of inheritance. Second, the old religion, which allowed a common worship only where there was a common parentage. Third, the terms of the language, which attest in the gens a common origin. The theory has also this other defect, that it supposes human societies to have commenced by a convention, and an artifice, a position which historical science cannot admit as true. 3. The gens is the family, still holding its primitive organization and its unity. All the evidence presents us the gens as united by the tie of birth. Let us again consult language. The names of the gentes, in Greece as well as in Rome, all have the form which was used in the two languages for patronymics. Claudius signifies the son of Clausus, and Butidae the sons of Butes. Those who think they see in the gens an artificial association set out from a false assumption. They suppose that a gens always consisted of several families having different names, and they cite the Cornelian gens, which did indeed include Scipios, Lentuli, Cossi, and Scyllae. But this is very far from having been a general rule. The Marcian gens appears never to have had more than a single line. We also find but one in the Lucretian gens, and but one in the Quintilian gens, for a long time. It would certainly be very difficult to tell what families composed the Fabian gens, for all the Fabii known in history belong manifestly to the same stock. At first they all bear the surname of Vibulanus. They all change it afterwards for that of Ambustus, which they replace still later by Maximus or Dorso. We know that it was customary at Rome for all patricians to have 3 names. One was called, for example, Publius Cornelius Scipio. It might be worthwhile to inquire which of these 3 names was considered as the true name. Publius was merely a name placed before, praenomen. Scipio was a name added, agnomen. The true name was Cornelius, and this name was at the same time that of the whole gens. Had we only this single indication regarding the ancient gens, it would justify us in affirming that there were Cornelii before there were Scipios, and not, as it is often said, that the family of the Scipios associated with others to form the Cornelian gens. History teaches us, in fact, that the Cornelian gens was, for a long time, undivided, and that all the members alike bore the surname of Maluginensis, and that of Cossus. It was not till the time of the dictator Camillus that one of its branches adopted the surname of Scipio. A little later, another branch took the surname of Rufus, which it replaced afterwards by that of Sylla. The Lentuli do not appear till the time of the Samnite Wars, the Cathegi not until the Second Punic War. It is the same with the Claudian gens. The Claudii remained a long time united in a single family, and all bore the surname of Sabinus, or of Regalensis, a sign of their origin. We follow them for 7 generations without seeing any branches formed in this family, although it had become very numerous. It was only in the 8th, that is to say, in the time of the First Punic War, that we see 3 branches separate and adopt 3 surnames, which became hereditary with them. These were the Pulchri, who continued during 2 centuries, the Kenthos, who soon became extinct, and the Neros, who continued to the time of the Empire. From all this it is clear that the gens was not an association of families, but that it was the family itself. It might either comprise only a single line, or produce several branches. It was always but one family. Besides, it is easy to account for the formation of the antique gens, and for its nature, if we but refer to the old belief and to the old institutions that we have already described. We shall see even that the gens is derived very naturally from the domestic religion and from the private law of the ancient ages. Indeed, what did this primitive religion prescribe? That the ancestor, that is to say, the man who was first buried in the tomb, should be perpetually honored as a god, and that his descendants assembled every year near the sacred place where he reposed should offer him the funeral repast. This fire always kept burning, this tomb always honored with a worship, were the center around which all later generations came to live, and by which all the branches of the family, however numerous they might be, remained grouped in a single body. What more does private law tell us of those ancient ages? While studying the nature of authority in the ancient family, we saw that the son did not separate from the father. While studying the rules for the transmission of the patrimony, we saw that, on account of the right of primogeniture, the younger brothers did not separate from the oldest. Hearth, tomb, patrimony, all these, in the beginning, were indivisible. The family, consequently, was also indivisible. Time did not dismember it. This indivisible family, which developed through ages, perpetuating its worship and its name from century to century, was really the antique gens. The gens was the family, but the family, having preserved the unity which its religion enjoined, and having attained all the development which ancient private law permitted it to attain. Footnote. We need not repeat what we have already said of agnation. See Book 2, Chapter 5. We can see that agnatio and gentilitas, the relationship of the gentiles, flowed from the same principles and were relationships of the same nature. The passage in the law of the 12 Tables, which assigns the inheritance to the gentiles in default of agnati, embarrassed the jurisconsults, and led to the opinion that there was an essential difference between these two kinds of kinship. But this difference is nowhere found. One was agnatus as one was gentilis, by masculine descent and the religious bond. There was only a difference of degree, which began when the branches of the same gens were separated. The agnatus was a member of the branch, the gentilis of the gens. There was therefore the same distinction between the terms gentilis and agnatus as between the words gens and familia. Familiam dicimus omnium agnatorum, says Ulpian in the Digest. One, when he wasn't the agnate of a man, was, for a still stronger reason, his gentilis. But he could not be a gentilis without being an agnate. The law of the 12 Tables gave the inheritance, in default of agnates, to those who were only gentilis of the deceased, that is to say, who were of his gens without being of his branch or of his familia. End of footnote. This truth admitted, all that the ancient writers have told us of the gens becomes clear. The close unity which we have remarked among its members is no longer surprising. They are related by birth, and the worship which they practice in common is not a fiction, it comes to them from their ancestors. As they are a single family, they have a common tomb. For the same reason, the law of the 12 Tables declares them qualified to inherit each other's property. For the same reason, too, they bear the same name. As all had, in the beginning, a single undivided patrimony, it was a custom, and even a necessity, that the entire gens should be answerable for the debt of one of its members, and that they should pay the ransom of the prisoner and the fine of the convict. All these rules became established of themselves while the gens still retained its unity. When it was dismembered, they could not disappear entirely. Of the ancient and sacred unity of this family, there remain persistent traces in the annual sacrifices which assembled the scattered members, in the name that remained common to them, in the legislation which recognized the right of gentiles to inherit, in their customs which enjoined them to aid each other. Footnote. The use of patronymics dates from this high antiquity and is connected with this old religion. Every gens transmitted the name of the ancestor from generation to generation with the same care as it perpetuated its worship. What the Romans called nomen was this name of the ancestor which all the members of the gens bore. A day came when each branch, becoming independent in certain respects, marked its individuality by adopting a surname, cognomen. Each person was, moreover, distinguished by a particular denomination, agnomen, as Caius or Quintus. But the true name, the official name, the sacred name, was that of the gens. This, coming from the first known ancestor, was to last as long as the family and the gods lasted. It was the same in Greece. Every Greek, at least if he belonged to an ancient and regularly established family, had, like the Roman patrician, 3 names. One was his individual name, another was that of his father, and as these two generally alternated with each other, they were together equivalent to the hereditary cognomen, which at Rome designated a branch of the gens. Lastly, the third name was that of the entire gens. Examples: Miltiades Kimonos Lakiadis, and in the following generation, Kaimon Miltiado Lakiadis. The Lakiadae formed a genos, as the Cornelii formed a gens. It was the same with the Butidae and the Phytalidae, etc. Pindar never extols his heroes without recalling the name of their genos. This name, in Greek, usually ended in idis or adis, and thus had an adjective form, just as the name of the gens among the Romans invariably ended in ius. This was nonetheless the true name. In daily life, a man might be called by his individual surname, but in the official language of politics or religion, his complete name, and above all, the name of the genos, was required. Later, the democracy substituted the name of the deme for that of the genos. The history of names followed a different course in ancient from what it has followed in modern times. In the Middle Ages, until the 12th century, the true name was the individual or baptismal name. Patronymics came quite late, as names of estates or surnames. It was just the reverse among the ancients, and this difference is due to the difference of the two religions. For the old domestic religion, the family was the true body, of which the individual was but an inseparable member. The patronymic was, therefore, the first name in date and in importance. The new religion, on the contrary, recognized in the individual complete liberty and entire personal independence, and was not in the least opposed to separating him from the family. Baptismal names were, therefore, the first, and for a long time the only, names. End of footnote. 4. The family, gens, was at first the only form of society. What we have seen of the family, its domestic religion, the gods which it had created for itself, the laws that it had established, the right of primogeniture on which it had been founded, its unity, its development from age to age until the formation of the gens, its justice, its priesthood, its internal government, carries us forcibly in thought towards a primitive epoch when the family was independent of all superior power and when the city did not yet exist. When we examine the domestic religion, those gods who belonged only to one family and exercised their providence only within the walls of one house, this worship which was secret, this religion which would not be propagated, this antique morality which prescribed the isolation of families, it is clear that beliefs of this nature could not have taken root in the minds of men, except in an age when larger societies were not yet formed. If the religious sentiment was satisfied with so narrow a conception of the divine, it was because human associations were then narrow in proportion. The time when men believed only in the domestic gods was the time when there existed only families. It is quite true that this belief might have subsisted afterwards, and even for a long time, when cities and nations existed. Man does not easily free himself from opinions that have once exercised a strong influence over him. This belief might endure, therefore, even when it was in disaccord with the social state. What is there indeed more contradictory than to live in a civil society and to have particular gods in each family? But it is clear that this contradiction did not always exist, and that at the epoch when this belief was established in the mind, and became powerful enough to form a religion, it corresponded exactly with the social state of man. Now, the only social state that is in accord with such a belief is that in which the family lives independent and isolated. In such a state, the whole Aryan race appears to have lived for a long time. The hymns of the Vedas confirm this for the branch from which the Hindus are descended, and the old beliefs and the old private laws attest it for those who finally became Greeks and Romans. If we compare the political institutions of the Aryas of the East with those of the Aryas of the West, we find hardly any analogy between them. If, on the contrary, we compare the domestic institutions of these various nations, we perceive that the family was constituted upon the same principles in Greece and in India. Besides, these principles were, as we have already shown, of so singular a nature that we cannot suppose this resemblance to have been the work of chance. Finally, not only do these institutions offer an evident analogy, but even the words that designate them are often the same in the different languages, which this race has spoken from the Ganges to the Tiber. From this fact we may draw a double conclusion. One is that the origin of domestic institutions among the nations of this race is anterior to the period when its different branches separated. The other is that the origin of political institutions is, on the contrary, later than this separation. The first were fixed from the time when the race still lived in its ancient cradle of Central Asia. The second were formed by degrees in the different countries to which its migrations conducted. We can catch a glimpse, therefore, of a long period during which men knew no other form of society than the family. Then arose the domestic religion, which could not have taken root in a society otherwise constituted, and which must long have been an obstacle to social development. Then also was established ancient private law, which was found later to be in disaccord with the interests of a more extended social organization, but which was in perfect harmony with the state of society in which it arose. Let us place ourselves in thought, therefore, in the midst of those ancient generations whose traces have not been entirely effaced, and who delegated their beliefs and their laws to subsequent ages. Each family has its religion, its gods, its priesthood. Religious isolation is a law with it. Its ceremonies are secret. In death even, or in the existence that follows it, families do not mingle. Each one continues to live apart in the tomb, from which the stranger is excluded. Every family has also its property, that is to say, its lot of land, which is inseparably attached to it by its religion. Its gods, termini, guard the enclosure, and its manas keep it in their care. Isolation of property is so obligatory that two domains cannot be contiguous, but a band of soil must be left between them, which must be neutral ground and must remain inviolable. Finally, every family has its chief, as a nation would have its king. It has its laws, which doubtless are unwritten, but which religious faith engraves in the heart of every man. It has its court of justice, above which there is no other that one can appeal to. Whatever a man really needs for his material or moral life, the family possesses within itself. It needs nothing from without. It is an organized state, a society that suffices for itself. But this family of the ancient ages is not reduced to the proportions of the modern family. In larger societies, the family separates and decreases, but in the absence of every other social organization, it extends, develops, and ramifies without becoming divided. Several younger branches remain grouped around an older one, near the one sacred fire and the common tomb. Still another element entered into the composition of this antique family: the reciprocal need which the poor has of the rich, and the rich has of the poor, makes servants. But in this sort of patriarchal regime, servant and slave were one. We can see indeed that the principle of a free and voluntary service, ceasing at the will of the servant, would ill accord with a social state in which a family lived isolated. Besides, the domestic religion did not permit strangers to be admitted into a family. By some means, then, the servant must become a member and an integrant part of the family. This was effected by a sort of initiation of the newcomer into the domestic worship. A curious usage that subsisted for a long time in Athenian houses shows us how the slave entered the family. They made him approach the fire, placed him in the presence of the domestic divinity, and poured lustral water upon his head. He then shared with the family some cakes and fruit. This ceremony bore a certain analogy to those of marriage and adoption. It doubtless signified that the newcomer, a stranger the day before, should henceforth be a member of the family and share in its religion. And thus the slave joined in the prayers and took part in the festivals. The fire protected him. The religion of the Lares belonged to him as well as to his master. This is why the slave was buried in the burial place of the family. But by the very act of acquiring this worship and the right to pray, he lost his liberty. Religion was a chain that held him. He was bound to the family for his whole life and after his death. His master could raise him from his base servitude and treat him as a free man, but the servant did not on this account quit the family. As he was bound to it by his worship, he could not without impiety separate from it. Under the name of freedman, or that of client, he continued to recognize the authority of the chief or patron, to be under obligations to him. He did not marry without the consent of the master, and his children continued to obey this master. There was thus formed in the midst of the great family a certain number of small families of clients and subordinates. The Romans attributed the establishment of clientship to Romulus, as if an institution of this nature could not have been the work of a man. Clientship is older than Romulus. Besides, it has existed in other countries, in Greece as well as in all Italy. It was not the cities that established and regulated it. They, on the contrary, as we shall presently see, weakened and destroyed it by degrees. Clientship is an institution of the domestic law, and existed in families before there were cities. We are not to judge of the clientship of earlier ages from the clients that we see in Horace's time. The client, it is clear, was for a long time a servant attached to a patron. But there was then something to give him dignity. He had a part in the worship, and was associated in the religion of the family. He had the same sacred fire, the same festivals, the same sacra as his patron. At Rome, in sign of this religious community, he took the name of the family. He was considered as a member of it by adoption, hence the close bond and reciprocity of duties between the patron and the client. Listen to the old Roman law. If a patron has done his client wrong, let him be accursed, sacer esto, let him die. The patron was obliged to protect his client by all the means and with all the power of which he was master, by his prayers as a priest, by his lance as a warrior, by his law as a judge. Later, when the client was called before the city tribunal, it was the patron's duty to defend him. It was his duty even to reveal to him the mysterious formulas of the law that would enable him to gain his cause. One might testify in court against a cognate, but not against a client. And men continued long to consider their duties towards clients as far above those towards cognates. Why? Because a cognate connected solely through women was not a relative and had no part in the family religion. The client, on the contrary, had a community of worship. He had, inferior though he was, a real relationship, which consisted, according to the expression of Plato, in adoring the same domestic gods. Clientship was a sacred bond which religion had formed, and which nothing could break. Once the client of a family, one could never be separated from it. Clientship was even hereditary. From all this we see that the family, in the earliest times, with its oldest branch and its younger branches, its servants and its clients, might comprise a very numerous body of men. a family that by its religion maintained its unity, by its private law rendered itself indivisible, and through the laws of clientship retained its servants, came to form in the course of time a very extensive organization, having its hereditary chief. The Aryan race appears to have been composed of an indefinite number of societies of this nature during a long succession of ages. These thousands of little groups lived isolated, having little to do with each other, having no need of one another, united by no bond religious or political, having each its domain, each its internal government, each its gods.